Hollywood in 1978 was a different world. The streets were lined with palm trees that swayed in the warm California breeze, and the city lights sparkled like diamonds against the night sky. It was a place where dreams came true, where ordinary people could become stars overnight. But it was also a place where those same dreams could turn into nightmares. Diana Hartwell was 32 years old and living the life most people only fantasized about. She had worked hard to get where she was, taking acting classes while waiting tables, going to audition after audition, facing rejection after rejection, but she never gave up. And finally, her persistence paid off. She landed a role in a television drama that became a hit. And suddenly everyone knew her name. People recognized her at restaurants. Magazines wanted to interview her. Directors were calling her agent with new opportunities. Diana had that special something that the camera loved. When she smiled, it lit up the screen. When she cried, audiences felt every tear. She was talented, beautiful, and on the verge of becoming a major star. She lived in a charming house in Laurel Canyon, one of those cozy hillside homes with big windows and a view of the city below. She shared it with her best friend Rachel, another actress who understood the crazy world they both lived in. They would stay up late talking about their dreams, drinking wine on the back patio, and laughing about the absurdity of Hollywood life. November of 1978 started out like any other month. Diana was excited because she had just gotten news that she was being considered for a leading role in a big-budget film. This wasn't just another television part. This was the kind of movie that could change everything, that could take her from being a recognizable face to becoming a household name. On a Thursday evening, the air was cool and crisp. Diana was getting ready to go out, and Rachel noticed she seemed nervous. Diana was putting on makeup in the bathroom mirror, her hands shaking slightly as she applied her lipstick. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked, leaning against the door frame. Diana looked at her reflection for a long moment before answering. "I'm meeting someone important tonight. A director who wants to discuss the film role." "That's great. Why do you seem worried?" Diana turned to face her friend. "I don't know. Something feels off about this whole thing. The way he contacted me, the fact that he wants to meet so late at night." Rachel tried to reassure her. "You're probably just nervous because this is such a big opportunity. You're going to do great." Diana smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She grabbed her jacket and her purse, gave Rachel a quick hug, and headed for the door. "I'll be back in a couple of hours," she said. Those would be the last words Rachel would ever hear her friend speak. Diana walked out to her cherry-red Mercedes, the car she had bought to celebrate her success. She loved that car. It represented everything she had worked for, everything she had achieved. She slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. Hours passed. Rachel wasn't too worried at first. Hollywood meetings often ran late, and maybe Diana had gone to dinner afterward. But when midnight came and went with no word from her friend, Rachel started to feel uneasy. She tried calling Diana, but this was before cell phones, so there was no way to reach her. By morning, Rachel was frantic. She called Diana's agent, her manager, even her parents who lived back east. No one had heard from her. That's when Rachel knew something was terribly wrong. Diana always called. She was responsible that way. She would never just disappear without telling anyone. Rachel contacted the police. At first, they didn't seem too concerned. People in Hollywood sometimes took off for a few days without telling anyone. Maybe she needed a break from the pressure. Maybe she was with a new boyfriend. But Rachel insisted that Diana would never do that. Not without calling. Not without letting someone know. 3 days after Diana walked out of her house, a jogger spotted her Mercedes parked on Mulholland Drive, that famous winding road that cuts through the Hollywood Hills. The car was just sitting there, perfectly parked on the side of the road. The keys were still in the ignition. Her purse was on the passenger seat with her wallet, credit cards, and identification still inside. Nothing appeared to be missing, but Diana was gone. The police investigation began in earnest. Detectives interviewed everyone who knew her. They talked to her co-stars, her agent, her family, her neighbors. They investigated her ex-boyfriends and looked into whether she had any enemies. In Hollywood, jealousy ran deep and success often bred resentment. Some people suggested she had run away, that the pressure of fame had become too much. But those who really knew Diana said that didn't make sense. She had worked too hard to get where she was. She wouldn't just abandon everything. Others whispered darker theories. Maybe an obsessed fan had taken her. Maybe she had gotten involved with dangerous people. Maybe she had witnessed something she shouldn't have seen. In Hollywood, there were always secrets, always shadows lurking behind the glamorous facade. The investigation went on for months. Detectives followed every lead, chased every tip. They searched the canyons and the beaches. They looked into organized crime connections and interviewed people from the film industry. But every trail went cold. Every door led to a dead end. Diana's family was devastated. Her mother aged 10 years in those months, holding on to hope that her daughter would walk through the door with some explanation. Her younger sister Margaret flew out from the East Coast to help with the search, putting up missing person posters all over Los Angeles, begging anyone with information to come forward. The media covered the story extensively at first. Diana's face was on the front page of newspapers, and news anchors discussed the mysterious disappearance on evening broadcasts. But as time passed and no new information emerged, the story faded from the headlines. Other scandals took its place. Other tragedies captured the public's attention. Years turned into decades. The case file gathered dust. Diana Hartwell became another unsolved mystery, another cautionary tale about the dark side of Hollywood. Her friends moved on with their lives, though they never forgot her. Her family held memorial services, though they had no body to bury. Rachel eventually moved out of the Laurel Canyon house. She couldn't stay there, couldn't bear the memories. But she never stopped wondering what happened that November night. She never stopped asking herself if there was something she could have done differently. Some way she could have stopped her friend from walking out that door. The truth about Diana's disappearance remained hidden, buried beneath years of silence and secrets. But the earth keeps its secrets only for so long. And sometimes when you least expect it, the ground opens up and reveals what has been hidden all along. The winter of 2023 brought something California hadn't seen in years. Rain poured down day after day, week after week. The kind of rain that turned streets into rivers and hillsides into mudslides. Weather forecasters warned people to stay home. Emergency services were stretched thin, responding to flooding and evacuations across Southern California. Topanga Canyon, a rugged area northwest of Los Angeles, was hit particularly hard. The steep hillsides, already unstable from years of drought followed by sudden heavy rainfall, couldn't hold. On a Wednesday morning in March, a massive section of earth simply gave way. Trees that had stood for decades tumbled down like toys. Boulders the size of cars rolled through the canyon. The sound was deafening, like thunder that wouldn't stop. When the dust finally settled, highway patrol officers arrived to assess the damage and close off the affected roads. The landslide had completely blocked a remote stretch of canyon road, creating a wall of mud and debris 15 feet high. Work crews would need weeks to clear it all away. But as emergency workers began surveying the scene, one of them noticed something odd. Partially buried in the mud, wedged between two massive boulders and the twisted roots of an uprooted oak tree, was something metallic. At first, it looked like it might be part of an old water tank or some kind of discarded machinery. But as they cleared away more debris, the shape became unmistakable. It was a vehicle. The car had been buried for so long that rust had eaten through much of the metal. What paint remained was faded and unidentifiable. Vegetation had grown through the windows. It looked more like a piece of the landscape than something that had once driven on roads. The emergency crew called in the police. This was no longer just about clearing a landslide. This was potentially a crime scene. Officers carefully excavated around the vehicle, working slowly and methodically. They knew that whatever story this car had to tell, it had waited decades to be heard. When they finally managed to pry open the driver's side door, they found what they had feared. Skeletal remains sat behind the wheel, still wearing the remnants of what had once been a leather jacket. The scene was haunting. This person had been here alone in this canyon for years, decades probably. Among the remains and debris inside the car, investigators found something crucial. Tucked in what was left of the jacket pocket was a wallet, protected just enough by the leather to preserve what was inside. When they carefully opened it, they found a California driver's license. The plastic was degraded and the photo was barely visible, but the name was still readable. Diana Hartwell. The discovery sent shockwaves through the Los Angeles Police Department. Officers who had worked on the original case in 1978 were long retired. Some had passed away. But the case file still existed, stored in boxes in the cold case archives. Diana Hartwell had been missing for 45 years. And now, finally, she had been found. News of the discovery spread quickly. Within hours, it was all over social media. True crime podcasts that had covered Diana's disappearance were updating their episodes. News stations were running special reports. Diana's name, which had faded from public memory, was suddenly everywhere again. For Margaret, Diana's younger sister, the phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. She was in her kitchen in Portland, Oregon, making lunch for her grandchildren when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer. She had been getting spam calls all week, but something made her pick up. The detective on the other end of the line was gentle but direct. They had found remains that they believed belonged to her sister. After all these years, after all the wondering and hoping and grieving, there was finally an answer. Margaret sat down heavily in a kitchen chair, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. She had been 17 when Diana disappeared. Her big sister, her hero, the one who had always told her to follow her dreams. Margaret had spent her entire adult life not knowing what happened. She had imagined every possible scenario, from Diana living secretly in another country, to the worst possibilities her mind could conjure. The not knowing had been the hardest part. Now she was 68 years old, a grandmother, and she was getting the call she had both dreaded and hoped for since she was a teenager. Diana had been dead this whole time. She hadn't run away. She hadn't started a new life somewhere. She had been in that canyon, just miles from where she had lived all along. But Margaret's relief at finally having answers was quickly replaced by new questions. How did Diana end up in Topanga Canyon? Her car had been found on Mulholland Drive, miles away in a completely different direction. Why was this a different vehicle? What happened that night? The police had questions too. They pulled out the old case files, dusty boxes filled with interview notes, photographs, and evidence from 1978. Detectives, who specialized in cold cases, began reviewing everything with fresh eyes and modern technology that hadn't existed back then. The car Diana had been found in was registered to someone else, a man who had reported it stolen in November of 1978. The same week Diana had disappeared. The original investigators had looked into the stolen car report at the time, but they had never connected it to Diana's case. Why would they? Diana's car had been found abandoned. No one had any reason to think she was driving a different vehicle. But now it was clear. Diana had switched cars that night. She hadn't driven her distinctive red Mercedes to meet the mysterious director. She had deliberately taken a different, less noticeable vehicle. The question was why. Was she afraid? Was she being cautious? Or was she planning something? The location where Diana was found added another layer to the mystery. The remote canyon road was barely used even now, and back in 1978 it had been even more isolated. There were no streetlights, no houses nearby. It wasn't on the way to anywhere in particular. Why would Diana have been driving there at night? Forensic experts began examining what was left of the vehicle. Despite decades of exposure to the elements, they were able to determine some crucial facts. The car had gone off the road at high speed. The impact damage suggested it hadn't been a controlled stop or a careful pullover. This vehicle had crashed hard. More concerning were the marks they found on what remained of the rear bumper and trunk. Even after all these years, the evidence suggested that another vehicle had made contact with Diana's car before it went over the edge. The pattern of the damage told a story. This hadn't been an accident. This had been a chase. As the investigation unfolded, people who had known Diana started coming forward with information they had been too afraid to share in 1978. Hollywood in that era had its own code of silence. People kept secrets. They looked the other way. Speaking up could end your career or worse. One elderly woman, a former script supervisor who had worked with Diana, called the police tip line. She had something to say, something she had kept quiet about for 45 years. Her voice shook as she began to speak. What she knew could finally explain why Diana had been running that night, and who might have been chasing her. Detective Rebecca Torres had been working cold cases for 12 years, but nothing had prepared her for this. She was sitting across from an 82-year-old woman named Patricia, who had worked in Hollywood during the 1970s. Patricia's hands trembled as she held a cup of tea, and her eyes were distant as if she was looking back through decades of memories she had tried to forget. I should have said something back then, Patricia whispered. But I was scared. We all were. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice gentle. You're doing the right thing now. Whatever you can tell us will help. Patricia took a shaky breath and began to speak. She had been a script supervisor on a film Diana was working on in the fall of 1978. It was a big production, the kind with a huge budget and major stars. Everyone was excited about it. But something wasn't right behind the scenes. The producer, a powerful man named Vincent Russo, was involved in things that had nothing to do with making movies. Patricia had noticed strange meetings happening late at night on the lot, after most of the crew had gone home. She had seen men in expensive suits who didn't look like they belonged in Hollywood. They looked like the kind of people you didn't ask questions about. One night in October, about a month before Diana disappeared, Patricia had forgotten her notebook in the production office. She went back to get it around 10 in the evening, thinking the building would be empty, but as she approached, she heard raised voices. She should have left. She knew that even then, but curiosity made her pause outside the door. Through the crack in the doorway, she could see Vincent arguing with two men she had never seen before. They were talking about money, large amounts of money, and something about shipments and percentages. Patricia didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. This wasn't movie business. This was something illegal. What she didn't know was that Diana was there too, just down the hall, working late on her script. Diana had heard everything Patricia heard and probably more. The next day, Patricia noticed Diana seemed shaken. They were friends, so during a break in filming, Patricia asked if everything was okay. Diana pulled her aside away from the others and spoke in a hushed voice. "Did you work late last night?" Diana asked. Patricia's stomach dropped. "I came back to get my notebook. Why?" "I heard them too," Diana said. "The producer and those men. Patricia, I think Vincent is using the production company to wash money for criminals. I think the whole movie is just a front." The two women stared at each other, the weight of what they knew sitting heavy between them. Patricia asked what they should do. Should they go to the police? Should they talk to someone? Diana shook her head. Men like that, men with that kind of power and those kinds of connections, they don't let people just walk away with their secrets. "We need to pretend we never heard anything," Patricia agreed. They made a pact that day to keep quiet, to act normal, to finish the film and move on with their lives. But Diana's behavior changed after that. Patricia noticed her looking over her shoulder. She saw Diana having quiet conversations on the phone, conversations where she would quickly hang up if anyone came near. Then, about 2 weeks before Diana disappeared, something happened that terrified both of them. They were on set when Vincent approached Diana with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Diana, sweetheart, I heard you've been working late hours," he said casually. "Dedicated to the craft. I admire that. But be careful. Sometimes people who work too late see things that confuse them. Hollywood can be a dangerous place when you're confused." It wasn't a direct threat. Vincent was too smart for that. But the message was clear. He knew that Diana had heard something, and he was warning her to stay quiet. Patricia saw the color drain from Diana's face. After Vincent walked away, Diana grabbed Patricia's arm. "I need to leave. I need to get out of here." "What do you mean?" "Quit the film." "No, I mean leave. Leave Los Angeles. Change my name. Disappear." Diana's eyes were wild with fear. "You didn't see his face." "He knows, Patricia. And if he knows, then his people know, and I'm not safe here." Patricia tried to calm her down, tried to tell her she was overreacting. But looking back now, sitting in the detective's office 45 years later, Patricia realized Diana had been absolutely right to be afraid. As Detective Torres listened to Patricia's story, she began pulling up old records on her computer. Vincent Russo had died in 1995, but his name appeared in multiple FBI investigations from the 1970s and early 1980s. He had been suspected of ties to organized crime, specifically money laundering through various business ventures, but he had never been charged with anything. He was too careful, too well protected. The investigation into Diana's case took on new urgency. Rebecca and her team started digging through Diana's financial records from 1978, records that had been sitting in storage all these years. What they found was revealing. In the 3 weeks before her disappearance, Diana had withdrawn almost $15,000 in cash from her bank account. Back then, that was a significant amount of money. She had been preparing to run. The team also discovered that Diana had rented a storage unit under a fake name just days before she vanished. The storage facility was still in business, and miraculously, the unit had never been cleaned out. There had been some kind of administrative error decades ago, and the unit had simply been forgotten in the system. The rent somehow continuing to be paid through an automated process that no one had ever canceled. When Rebecca and her team opened that storage unit, they found a time capsule from 1978. There were suitcases packed with clothes, wigs in different colors, and 3 fake IDs with Diana's photo but different names. There was also a journal. Rebecca sat in the storage unit and carefully opened the journal, knowing she was about to read the last thoughts of a woman who had been dead for 45 years. Diana's handwriting filled the pages, starting casual and lighthearted, then becoming increasingly frantic. The early entries talked about her career, her excitement about the new film, her dreams for the future, but then the tone shifted. She wrote about the conversation she had overheard, about Vincent's veiled threats, about her growing paranoia that she was being followed. One entry, dated November 10th, just days before she disappeared, read, "I can't sleep anymore. Every car that passes my house, I wonder if it's them. Every phone call makes me jump. I've been collecting cash, getting the fake IDs. I have a plan to disappear, to start over somewhere far away. Maybe Canada, maybe Europe. Somewhere Vincent and his people will never find me." The next entry was even more chilling. "Someone broke into my house last night. Nothing was taken, but things were moved. My scripts were out of order. My mail had been gone through. They're letting me know they can get to me whenever they want. I'm not safe here. I have to go soon." The final entry was dated November 16th, the day Diana disappeared. Her handwriting was shaky, rushed. "I got a call from someone claiming to be a director. Says he wants to meet tonight about a new role. But something feels wrong. The way he talked, the things he knew about me. I think it's a trap. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm so paranoid that I'm ruining legitimate opportunities? I don't know what to believe anymore. I've arranged to borrow Tom's car instead of taking my own. If this goes bad, at least they won't know what I'm driving. I'm scared. But I have to know if I'm really in danger, or if I've lost my mind." Rebecca closed the journal and looked at her team. Diana had known she was in danger. She had tried to protect herself, tried to be smart about it. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. The people hunting her had been patient, methodical, and ultimately successful. Now the question was, could they prove it? Detective Rebecca Torres spread crime scene photos across her desk, images taken from the canyon where Diana's car had been found. Modern forensic technology could tell stories that investigators in 1978 never could have imagined. She had called in specialists from the state crime lab, experts who could analyze evidence that had sat buried for decades. The forensic team worked meticulously on what remained of the vehicle. Despite the rust and decay, they were able to extract crucial information. The pattern of damage to the car told a clear story. The rear bumper showed impact marks consistent with being struck by another vehicle multiple times. The angle of the impact suggested the other car had been trying to force Diana off the road. They also analyzed the tire marks that had been preserved under layers of sediment. When a landslide buries something, it can actually protect evidence in ways that wouldn't survive exposed to the elements. The tire tracks showed 2 vehicles, one slightly larger than the other. The tracks weaved back and forth across the narrow canyon road in what was clearly a high-speed chase. But the most damning evidence came from paint transfer. Tiny flecks of black paint were found embedded in the damaged rear bumper of Diana's borrowed car. The forensic team was able to analyze the chemical composition of that paint. It matched a type commonly used on luxury sedans in the late 1970s, specifically a brand popular among wealthy businessmen and, notably, certain criminal organizations. Rebecca pulled up the FBI files on Vincent Russo again. According to surveillance reports from 1978, Vincent had owned several vehicles, including a black luxury sedan. The FBI had been watching him, building a case that never quite came together. He had too many lawyers, too many connections, too much money, but they had documented his vehicles, his associates, his movements. One of Vincent's known associates was a man named Anthony DeLuca, who had worked as what the FBI called an enforcer. Anthony had disappeared from Los Angeles in December of 1978, just weeks after Diana vanished. According to the reports, He had relocated to Nevada and lived there until his death in 2001. He had never been charged with any crimes despite being suspected in several unsolved cases. Rebecca's team tracked down Anthony's old vehicle registration records. In November of 1978, he had owned a black luxury sedan. 2 weeks after Diana disappeared, he had gotten rid of it, selling it for scrap. The car had been completely destroyed, crushed at a junkyard. At the time, no one had thought anything of it. Now it looked incredibly suspicious. The investigation expanded as Rebecca dug deeper into Vincent's operation. She discovered that 3 other young women connected to the film industry had disappeared in Southern California between 1976 and 1980. None of their cases had ever been solved. None of them had been officially connected. But now, looking at them together with modern eyes, Rebecca saw a pattern. All 3 women had worked on productions connected to Vincent Russo. All 3 had disappeared without a trace. Their vehicles found abandoned in different locations around Los Angeles. All 3 cases had gone cold within months. Rebecca reached out to the FBI's Organized Crime Division. An agent named Michael Chen had been studying criminal enterprises from that era. When Rebecca told him what she had found, he wasn't surprised. "We always suspected Vincent was eliminating people who knew too much," Michael explained over a video call, "but we could never prove anything. These guys were professionals. They knew how to make problems disappear. And back then, we didn't have the technology or the databases we have now. Cases from different jurisdictions didn't get connected the way they do today." With Michael's help, Rebecca started building a comprehensive picture of Vincent's criminal network. It was larger than anyone had realized. The movie production company was just one piece of a vast operation that laundered money through real estate, restaurants, and various entertainment ventures. Vincent had been moving millions of dollars for organized crime families, taking his cut and living like royalty in Beverly Hills. The evidence was mounting, but there was a problem. Vincent was dead. Anthony was dead. Most of the major players from that era were either dead or too old and sick to prosecute. The justice system couldn't touch ghosts. But then Rebecca got a break. One of Vincent's former accountants, a man named Harold Finch, was still alive and living in Arizona. He was 79 years old and suffering from advanced heart disease. When Rebecca tracked him down, Harold's wife answered the door with a tired, knowing look. "You're here about Vincent," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Harold agreed to talk. He had been carrying guilt for decades, and with his health failing, he wanted to unburden himself. He sat in his living room with an oxygen tank beside him and told Rebecca everything. "I knew what Vincent was doing," Harold said, his voice weak but clear. "I kept 2 sets of books for him. The real ones and the ones we showed the authorities. I was young and stupid, and he paid me well to keep my mouth shut. But I wasn't stupid enough to not keep insurance." Harold revealed that he had kept copies of the real financial records, hidden away for all these years. He had been too afraid to come forward while Vincent was alive, afraid of what might happen to him and his family. But now, with Vincent long dead and his own life coming to an end, Harold wanted to do the right thing. The documents Harold provided were explosive. They showed exactly how the money laundering operation worked, which films were used as fronts, how cash was moved and cleaned. The records also showed payments to Anthony DeLuca, marked as security services that occurred with suspicious regularity, often right before or after someone connected to Vincent's operation had a problem that mysteriously resolved itself. There was a payment to Anthony dated November 17th, 1978, the day after Diana disappeared. The amount was $50,000, far more than a typical payment. In the margin, Harold had made a small notation. "Dekar matter handled." Rebecca stared at those words. Dr. Diana's initials. This was as close to a confession as they were going to get. This single notation, preserved in an old ledger for 45 years, proved that Diana's death had been ordered and paid for. But the documents revealed something else, something that shocked even Rebecca. The notation about Diana wasn't the only one. There were 3 other sets of initials with similar notations and payments to Anthony over a 4-year period. The other missing women. They had all been murdered on Vincent's orders, all handled by the same man, all buried in the same kind of paperwork under vague descriptions. Rebecca contacted the families of the other missing women. The conversations were difficult. These families had lived for decades not knowing what happened to their daughters, their sisters, their friends. Now they finally had answers, but the answers brought no real justice. The men responsible were dead. No one would stand trial. No one would go to prison. Margaret flew to Los Angeles to meet with Rebecca in person. She wanted to see the evidence, to understand exactly what had happened to her sister. Rebecca showed her everything: the journal entries, the forensic reports, the financial records. Margaret read Diana's final journal entry 3 times, tears streaming down her face. She knew. Margaret whispered. She knew she was in danger and she was trying so hard to save herself. And no one helped her. No one protected her. Rebecca had no words of comfort to offer. Margaret was right. The system had failed Diana. Hollywood had failed her. Everyone who could have helped her had looked the other way, either because they were scared or because they didn't want to see what was happening in their glamorous world. But there was one thing Rebecca could still do. She could tell Diana's story. She could make sure people knew what happened and why. She could connect the other cases and give those families answers too. And maybe, just maybe, she could prevent something like this from happening again. The story began to spread beyond the cold case unit. News organizations picked it up. Documentaries started being planned. Diana's case became a symbol of how power and money had corrupted Hollywood, how people had been sacrificed to protect secrets and profits, and then, just when Rebecca thought they had found every piece of the puzzle, something unexpected happened. A phone call came in from someone who claimed to have witnessed what happened the night Diana died. Someone who had stayed silent out of fear for 45 years but was finally ready to tell the truth. The man's name was Thomas Brennan, and he was 81 years old. He called Detective Rebecca Torres from a hospice center in Northern California, his voice barely above a whisper. He had terminal cancer. The doctors had given him weeks to live, and he said he couldn't die with this secret still buried inside him. Rebecca drove 5 hours to meet him the next day. Thomas was sitting in a chair by the window when she arrived, an IV pole beside him, his face gaunt and pale. But his eyes were clear, and when he spoke, there was a steadiness to his voice that came from finally unburdening himself of something that had haunted him for decades. "I was a park ranger back then," Thomas began. "Worked in the Topanga Canyon area, November 16, 1978. I was on patrol late that night checking the remote trails. It was past 11, maybe closer to midnight. I saw headlights on one of the old canyon roads moving fast. Too fast for those narrow roads." He paused, taking a labored breath before continuing. "I heard tires squealing, engines revving. It sounded wrong, dangerous, so I drove toward the sound. By the time I got close, I saw 2 cars. One was chasing the other, ramming it from behind. The car being chased was swerving, trying to get away, but there was nowhere to go. That road barely fits one vehicle." Rebecca leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. This was it. This was someone who had actually witnessed what happened to Diana. The car in front, the one being chased, it couldn't handle the curves at that speed. The car behind gave it one final hit and it went over the edge. Just disappeared into the darkness. I heard the crash, heard metal tearing and glass breaking, then silence. Thomas's hands shook as he clutched the blanket on his lap. The other car stopped. A man got out. Big guy, expensive suit. He walked to the edge and looked down. Didn't seem upset or worried. Just looked, like he was checking to make sure a job was done. Then he got back in his car and drove away slowly like nothing had happened. "Why didn't you report it?" Rebecca asked gently, though she already knew the answer. "I was about to," Thomas said. "I started to drive toward where the car went over, to see if I could help whoever was down there. But then 2 more cars appeared. They blocked my path. Men got out, and I knew immediately these weren't ordinary people. One of them walked up to my Ranger truck. He didn't threaten me directly, but he didn't have to. He looked at my badge, said my name out loud, said he knew where I lived, knew I had a wife and 2 little girls." Thomas's voice cracked. He told me I didn't see anything that night. Said if I was smart, I'd forget I was even in the canyon. Said accidents happen to curious people all the time, and wouldn't it be a shame if my family had an accident? Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. This was how they had operated. Not just eliminating the immediate problem, but silencing any potential witnesses with threats that were all too real. "I was a coward," Thomas continued, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. "I drove home that night and I never said a word. Not to my supervisor, not to the police, not even to my wife. I kept that secret for 45 years. I told myself I was protecting my family, but really I was just protecting myself. Someone died that night and I did nothing. You're doing something now, Rebecca said softly. You're giving that person justice. Thomas nodded slowly. When I saw the news about the actress being found in the canyon, I knew it was the same place. I knew it was the car I saw go over that night. I can't make it right, but at least I can tell the truth before I go. Rebecca recorded Thomas's full statement over the next 2 hours. He described the location precisely, the type of vehicles, the approximate time. Everything matched the physical evidence. His testimony filled in the final gaps in the timeline of Diana's last night alive. But Thomas had something else to tell her. After that night in 1978, he had started paying attention to news reports about missing people, about unsolved cases. Over the next few years, he noticed other young women connected to the entertainment industry disappearing. He started keeping newspaper clippings, though he never came forward about what he knew. I wasn't the only one who was threatened into silence, Thomas said. I heard rumors over the years from other people who worked in law enforcement back then. People who were told to drop certain investigations, people who were warned not to look too closely at certain cases. It was a network of fear and corruption. And a lot of us just went along with it because we were scared. Rebecca left the hospice center with a witness statement that would never result in a trial, but would finally close the case. Thomas passed away 2 weeks later, and Rebecca attended his funeral. His daughter approached her afterward, thanking her for giving her father peace in his final days. He was never the same after something that happened in the late 70s, his daughter said. He became withdrawn, anxious. We never knew why. Now at least we understand. Back in Los Angeles, Rebecca compiled everything into a comprehensive report. Though no one could be prosecuted, the case was officially solved. Diana Hartwell had been murdered on November 16, 1978, run off a canyon road by an enforcer, working for Vincent Russo because she had witnessed criminal activity that could have destroyed his operation. The other 3 missing women were also officially connected to the same criminal network. Their families finally had answers after decades of uncertainty. It wasn't the justice they deserved, but it was closure. Margaret held a memorial service for Diana at a cemetery in Los Angeles. It was attended by hundreds of people, many who had never met Diana but felt connected to her story. Old friends from the industry came, some of them famous now, others who had left Hollywood years ago. Patricia was there, crying quietly as she placed flowers on the grave. "I'm sorry I didn't do more," Patricia whispered to Margaret. "Maybe if I had been braver back then." Margaret took her hand. "You were as much a victim as Diana was. That's how these people operated. They made everyone too afraid to speak up. But you spoke up now when it mattered." The case sparked a wider investigation into cold cases from the 1970s and 80s. A task force was formed to look specifically at unsolved disappearances connected to the entertainment industry. They began finding patterns, connections that had been missed before. More families got answers. More cases were closed. A documentary about Diana's life and death premiered on streaming platforms 6 months after her remains were discovered. It became one of the most watched true crime documentaries of the year. People who had never heard of Diana Hartwell discovered her work through old television episodes and fell in love with her talent. Young actresses who watched the documentary started speaking up about abuse and intimidation they had experienced in the industry. Diana's story became a catalyst for change, encouraging people to break their silence about wrongdoing. The fear and intimidation that had kept people quiet for so long began to lose its power. Margaret established a foundation in Diana's name to support victims of violence and to fund cold case investigations. She used the money from Diana's estate, which had been held in trust all these years, to help other families get the answers she had finally received. On the first anniversary of finding Diana's remains, Rebecca stood at the edge of Topanga Canyon where the car had gone over. A small memorial had been placed there, with Diana's photo and a plaque that read, "Diana Hartwell, 1946-1978. Her light was taken too soon, but her story will never be forgotten." Rebecca thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by this case. Thomas, who had finally found peace by telling the truth. Harold, who had unburdened himself of decades of guilt. Patricia, who had survived carrying a terrible secret, and Margaret, who had spent most of her life wondering what happened to her sister and could now finally grieve properly. Justice hadn't been served in the traditional sense. No one went to prison. No trial brought accountability. But the truth had been told. The silence had been broken. And maybe, Rebecca thought, that was its own kind of justice. Diana's story would live on not just as a cautionary tale about the dark side of Hollywood, but as a reminder that speaking up matters, that truth matters, that every person deserves to be remembered, and their story deserves to be told, even if it takes 45 years and a landslide to bring that truth to light. As Rebecca walked back to her car, she thought about all the other cold cases still waiting to be solved, all the other families still waiting for answers. Diana's case had shown her that time doesn't erase the truth. It just buries it. And sometimes when the moment is right, the earth gives back what it has been hiding and the truth finally surfaces. Diana Hartwell had vanished without a trace in 1978, but she hadn't been forgotten, and now, finally, she could rest in peace.